live. Hello, and welcome to the Readable Century. It is Chris, Jason, and our comrade Matthew, who is generally our France correspondent. But today he is just Matthew, a guy who talks about the Soviet Union.
He's our Soviet past correspondent.
France current, Soviet past.
Yeah.
I was going to say, no, never mind. Victor Serge is Belgian, right?
Yeah, he's Belgian.
Yeah.
Okay, same thing though, really, right? Don't tell the northern Belgians I said that.
It depends
though.
on who you ask, right?
In Wallonia, yes, but not in. What's the other one?
As an
Flanders.
American, the major contribution to the world that the Belgians have given us is the French fries. So as far as I'm concerned, they're French.
And also 2 world wars.
Wait, they gave us the World War? Well, I guess, yeah, Britain's involvement is specifically because of... Well, also genocide in Africa, right?
Well, also
I've got the Congo thing.
Germany's invasion of France is only possible because of Belgium.
Right. Yep. So Belgium's role in
Way
history,
to go, Belgium.
Belgium's role in the 20th century has been as a highway for Germany to get into France.
Uh-huh. My
Anyways,
favorite. Well, no, okay, yeah. Well, yeah. Let's not talk about Belgian anecdotes. Let's just
fake
move
country.
on.
Yeah,
Well, that's what I was gonna say. It's there was
ahead.
this one time they didn't have a government and just nobody noticed.
Yeah, for like 2 years or something, right?
Yeah, just like
Yeah.
Right. Anyway,
I think Germany should invade Belgium again, personally.
I'm gonna.
They're going to build up an army, and what are they going to do with it? They're not going to use it against Russia.
Practice on the Belgians.
Yeah, just practice on the Belgians.
That's what they do.
What could go wrong?
Nothing, man. When I heard that Germany was rearming to stop a world war, I was like, yes, historically, that is what has happened.
Right.
As a student of German history, I have to say that this makes perfect sense, and I approve. Hey, though, that's good for my job prospects, though. If Germany starts invading other countries again, then damn, dude, there's going to be people who want to talk about Germany, and maybe I'll get a job. Yep. Anyway, so that is not why we're here today.
World War III, but Chris has a job.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Germany doesn't have nukes, though. So if we're going to war against Germany, that's fine.
Yeah.
Because Russia has nukes. We can't go to war against them.
Well, France has nukes, and France wants to extend its nuclear umbrella to its allies in Europe. So.
Oh, isn't that swell?
It's
so funny. Like, the second that Germany's like, we're going to rearm, France is like, oh, yes, but we have nukes, and we will protect you, Germany, if you like.
Right.
Anyway, so we're here actually to talk about a new podcast that you guys are doing,
Surprise.
Of which I have heard the first episode, or one of the first episodes. It's really good, but it's called Unbreakable Union, and it is a history of the Soviet Union. The one that I listened to is the one episode that does the preliminary background for talking about the Soviet Union, which is the Russian Revolution, and it's really good. It's really quick, but it's really good. It's very thorough for how quick it was. But the reason we're here is not just to announce a podcast, because we could have done that by just like posting the first episode of your podcast saying, hey, it's a podcast. But why?
You've done that before.
Why do people talk about the Soviet Union? Why should we talk about the Soviet Union? What's the point in reading, talking, discussing the Soviet Union in the 21st century? Years after it has collapsed and ceased to be relevant to the contemporary politics, or has it? I mean, it has collapsed. Has it ceased to be? No, okay, so has it ceased to be relevant is what I meant. But there was one time whenever I lived in Austin in the early 2000s where I used to listen to Alex Jones's podcast, just for shits and giggles, right? Because
this is your fault.
Actually,
I
I'm
listen
sorry.
for the shits, but not for the giggles.
Actually, I said podcast. This was before podcasts. This is when it was a
Right.
radio show, and I used to work for a coffee catering company, and I would drive around in the morning and listen to his radio show. And he had a guest on one time that was talking about how basically the Soviet Union is pretending to be gone, and what it's doing. It's basically going to do that scene from The Simpsons, you know,
right?
where
Yeah.
It lulls everybody into a false sense of security, and then just presses the button, and the Berlin Wall pops back up, and Lenin crashes. Anyway, so this guy
punches
literally
out of his glass
thought,
coffin. Yeah.
He literally thought that Putin was like the new premier of the sleeper Soviet Union, and he was about to like pop back up, and it was going to be communism all over again. But anyway, so that's what we're here to talk about.
I mean, that's basically the reason why we're doing this podcast.
Yes.
I mean,
no, that is not.
Matthew, why don't you take this one first?
Thanks. Why do this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of funny as you were talking. I was like, well, why talk about the Soviet Union? And then I'm thinking, like, why do this to ourselves? Like, why tackle the history of the Soviet Union in a way that's like that's sort of relatable and listenable to by an audience? So first of all, I think that rather than saying, okay, communism is going to come back, Lenin's going to punch out of his iron tomb, and we'll have missile parades and all that shit again.
Fingers crossed, man.
Yeah, right. So one can hope, a boy can dream. Is rather to compare our current situation in the 21st century in the West, or after the triumph of capitalism over communism, and evaluate in the light of that our own situation, our own society. So, for example, the common line on the Soviet Union is that democracy triumphed, communism, totalitarianism, tyranny has failed, right? But we have to ask ourselves, if democracy has triumphed, where is it? Democracy is in retreat across frontiers. It's in retreat in Europe. It's in retreat in the United States, and it's in retreat in Latin America. So what's happened?
In the words of John Reed, we could say, where is the goddamn democracy?
This is a war for democracy. Where is the goddamn democracy? Yeah, and I think that's a prescient point. Where? If democracy has won, who did it beat, and where did it go? And that's why I think that's why we should talk about the Soviet Union. That's why a podcast about the Soviet Union is apropos. Why it's necessary even. The other thing about why is just it doesn't seem like anybody else has done it, which surprises me.
Exactly.
Yeah,
very surprising to me.
Jason and I had this idea a couple of years ago, and we started it. We started writing and we started recording, and then we stopped because we're cool like that. And now we've started again. When we started years ago,
part of it was also like it was, I was still working out like how to be after the accident.
Okay.
Yeah. You were. You started recording
reasons.
Started recording this in the middle of Jason's first year of recovery from his brain injury.
Right.
So like,
which is just to say, like, we have more excuses than just losing interest in a project.
I was gonna.
You had
I was gonna
excuse. I'm just cool like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to interject, like whenever you said, "Where is the democracy?" Specifically, looking at the former Soviet Union, the what exists now in the patchwork of states from the collapse of the Soviet Union is infinitely less democratic than the Soviet Union was.
Right.
I was going to say the democracy is in Turkmenistan. It's really obvious because of the giant statue to Turkmenbashi, the father of the Turkmen.
Right, and like it's essentially a collection of oligarchic gangster states that are not democratic at all and are infinitely more corrupt and unstable, with more deaths of despair and wars and everything else than the Soviet Union. So I got to say, it seems to me like the fall of the Soviet Union has been a net negative for the world.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is the other thing, So to get back to the other point is like nobody else seems to be doing it. We know a lot about this because of our personal backgrounds. I'm a historian and political scientist. Jason's an anthropologist. We spent decades of our lives in study groups talking about this subject. When we talked about the Soviet Union, unfortunately, we usually restricted those conversations to the Soviet Union in its revolutionary form. Which is to say, even before even the beginning of the Soviet Union, like even 1917 to 1922.
Episode 0B,
Yeah,
basically
that's
it,
what we
really.
would focus on.
The
Yeah,
true
that-
Scotsman form of the Soviet Union, if you will.
Yes.
there you go.
Yeah.
But then the other thing, yeah, Chris, to your point about the demise of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin, however many years ago, had a line where he said the collapse of the Soviet Union was the single most catastrophic geopolitical event in world history. I might be overstating it, but if I am, it's not by much. No, he said the
Sure.
greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century.
No,
That was
definitely.
his quote in the statement, but the statement in the press was castigated. It was how could he say this? The fall of the Soviet Union was a good thing. It wasn't a catastrophe. Democracy has triumphed, you know.
And also, that's
and
the
it was
proof that they use now to show that after he takes Ukraine, he's coming for the rest of the former Eastern Bloc.
right, which connects to
Yeah.
your conspiracy theorist on the Alex Jones show.
Right.
It's like
Funnily
he's
enough,
just- he-
it's liberals now that say this, and not just like the fucking right wing psychos.
Yeah,
From the
isn't
early
it funny how
2000s.
that happens?
Yeah. it is.
Yeah.
Conspiranoia is like now a firmly liberal project in the United States. I mean, it's
Right.
also still a right wing one, but you know.
Right. I think if you look at the consequences of the world events of the past 30 years, you have to say, like, this is perhaps the most correct thing the man has ever said, or anyone could possibly say about the Soviet Union,
Sure,
is that its
sure.
collapse was a geopolitical catastrophe. And that doesn't put other geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century in some kind of, it doesn't put them in some kind of second tier or something like that. It's just to recognize how disastrous the fall of this country, the disassembly of the Soviet Union has been, not only for the region, but for Europe, for Asia, and the world entirely. We could talk about, like the gangsterism that came to the fore in Putin's cronies and as they dismantled the state and sold it off to like either the highest bidder or the most connected figure, thug, that
Right.
was in Putin's circle. You could talk about the effect that had on the Russian population. And incidentally, I've seen one of my, I don't know, I've been told I have strange ways of relaxing, but I like to go on YouTube and sometimes find conversations of people who lived in the former Soviet states and listen to their opinions. I lived in Germany for a while, and I was always fascinated by nostalgia, like the nostalgia for the East. And there's the sentiment is like, how could we lose this country?
Right.
Yeah.
Our personal lives have taken huge cuts, taken huge hits, in the intervening years. But also just in a sense of civic pride or national pride. I guess you would call that patriotism or something. They thought that they really had something. The Soviet Union really meant something, a union of peoples in this part of the world that doesn't exist anymore. If you take that farther and say, why study the Soviet Union? And I'll stop talking after. I always think, like, what am I going to say? And then I can't stop. I get too lazy to quit. I think if you examine, like, what role did the Soviet Union play, for example, in the revolts, the anti-colonial revolts in the Third World? What role did it play in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa? What role did it play in the civil rights movement in the United States? Now, in some cases, there are Soviet agents involved in these things, and in some cases not. I think to the broader point, in the United States, for example, we had things like the space race. We thought we wanted to stand up for ourselves and show ourselves to be a better society in the face of the Soviet Union. In Europe, you had a social safety net, or the nanny state, that wanted to take care of its population because they wanted to show that capitalism could do this. Capitalism could perform humanely, could construct stable societies and stable states that took care of you in your old age, for example, because of the Soviet Union. In the absence of the Soviet Union, all of these things are falling apart. Like, you don't have to look at South Africa, but look at like opinions of South Africa that are coming out of the United States.
Yeah.
Where the ambassador has just been ejected, for example. Look at how the social safety net, such as it exists in countries like where I live in France, is suddenly on the chopping block. We can't defend our retirements. We were saying earlier, Macron wants to rehabilitate a European army. Well, that's going to come out of the social state. Those cuts, if the United States isn't going to fund NATO, the people of France and Europe will have to, and that's going to mean giving up on their benefits. That's going to mean giving up on free education. And the reason
Free
that all of
ride's over, you bunch of fucking moochers.
that's I know,
I mean, for real though, like Europe has been able to artificially extend its social safety net while having this quote like protective umbrella provided by
Yeah.
the United States and NATO.
yeah, no doubt. That's true.
I would maintain that it doesn't need it, but whatever.
What, NATO? No, definitely not.
No
Yeah.
one needs NATO. NATO sucks.
Yeah, NATO should go away. But anyway,
The best part of the best argument, well, one of the really good arguments for that is that Russia has tried to join NATO like what 4 times.
Yeah.
So who is other than like overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya and making room for slave markets? What is NATO for?
Well, they bombed the Serbs, killed a bunch of kids, and,
Oh, that's right.
Stuff like that.
well, in geopolitics or in
Yeah.
regional alliances or configurations of state and defense or whatever, that's the other big question of why study the Soviet Union. Look what's happening in Ukraine. You want to know
Right.
why that shit's going down? You have to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, why Ukraine existed as an independent state in the first place. And all of that's bound up in the history of the Soviet Union. If you want to
Right.
understand where we are right now in the world and where it is likely we seem to be going, the Soviet Union is a very good subject to take a look at.
And specifically, the regions that are being contested by the Russians and the Ukrainians are different regional gifts by Russia to Ukraine over the process of the history of the Soviet Union. You get
Right.
like the Donbass area given to
Yep.
Ukraine, and then
Yep.
Crimea given to Ukraine by Khrushchev. But so like the portions that are being fought over now are direct results of decisions made by the Soviet Union,
Right.
including the existence of Ukraine as a state is
Yeah.
a direct result of the Soviet Union making the Ukrainian SSR in
Yep.
the 1920s.
That's exactly right. So I share Matthew's opinion entirely. So I would say that, but I would also add, why? Because I'm a huge nerd, and I have
Because it's cool.
well, yeah, because it's cool. No, so I have read about Soviet history for my entire life. I think the first book about a certain period in Soviet history, I think I read it when I was like, I want to say it was 12, maybe 13. And I've never stopped. I've never lost interest. And so, yes, of course, there's all kinds of really interesting political, philosophical debates that I have had and I have engaged in as a part of the American left for any amount of time. But Soviet history has always been an interest of mine that I've never had much of an outlet for. So like when we talk about the 1918 and 1924 constitutions, let alone the later what we're projecting for later seasons, the 1936 Constitution, the 1977 Constitution. I have so many things to say about this stuff already from a long time ago. When we talk about, I mean, of course, inter-party conflict is very interesting, but also like, what is the Khrushchev thaw? You know, what is the foreign policy of the Brezhnev administration? What are the possibilities for perestroika and glasnost? Like, there's so much there. So it's not just philosophical and political and historical, but it's also just like, this is so interesting to me. If we're taking into consideration the ways in which you can learn about what to do from what has happened, if we're taking that seriously, there's so much more than just there was a revolution and there were communists and there was a global power struggle and then now it's all over. Like there's plenty in there. But in the granular details, there are whole worlds. There's like, honestly, you know, when this came up before, you said this is a project which inexplicably, it seems, doesn't seem to have been taken up. You know, like the history of Rome, the Age of Napoleon, the Revolutions podcast. These are enormous projects in scope.
Yeah.
But the history of the Soviet Union, like by decade, is an enormous project in its own right. And it's so big. It's like, it kind of makes sense that no one has taken it up, because who the fuck wants to sit around and read this stuff? Other than, well, I do. Matthew does. Huge nerds do. So let us do it for you.
There you go.
Yeah. I actually am slightly lesser of a Soviet Union nerd than the two of you, but only slightly, I think. But yeah, I think that I've actually done a little bit of graduate study, as one of my advisors is a Soviet historian. So we've actually got a bunch of episodes that are based around books that I read in graduate school about the Soviet Union that are on our Patreon. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to this podcast. I can't wait for you guys to start posting the episodes, which I think is what you said is going to begin in the beginning of April 1st specifically.
Thank you for making that have to be a thing now.
Yeah.
I really like that we have decided that we have to launch this by April Fool's Day.
Well, you could always just not launch it on April Fool's Day and be like, psych.
Yeah, sucker.
Oh, there we go. That's
gotcha. Yeah. I mean, honestly, whenever I think of the reasons to study the Soviet Union, I think just as much part of equal importance to what we can learn about this to do from the Soviet Union is we can learn what not to do by studying the Soviet Union.
And there's a fair bit of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the Soviet Union is both like a heroic inspiration and cautionary tale, like the dialectical synthesis of the two, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, and I think that one of the mistakes of the left, the world leftist, the world workers movement, has been the emulation without sort of critical understanding of the events that happened in the Soviet Union or the models prescribed by the Comintern, etc. And I think that as proponents of workers' democracy, as proponents of socialism, a thorough understanding of the great historic triumphs and failures it's essential. And I'm not only like a read more theory guy, I'm also a read more history guy, because theory without an understanding of history is almost as useless as theory without action.
Yeah, well, and that makes me that reminds me of another Vladimir Putin quote, which I really like, and I'm going to use it, but with an addendum. He said that anyone who does not lament the disappearance of the Soviet Union, he has no heart. But anyone who wants to recreate the Soviet Union has no brain. And I agree with that, but with this one asterisk, which is pretty significant. Anyone who wants to recreate the old Soviet Union has no brain. But if you want to have a meaningful practice as a person who engages in the politics of your society critically, some version, the aspirations that were clamored for and attempted anyways to actualize in Soviet history, from the law on cooperatives to the whatever, every single aspect of it. These things are just things we should just lament and say, oh, that's too bad that that's gone. What is a better way to do things now? Because a better way to do things is definitely not coming from the Chuck Schumers or the Emmanuel Macrons or the Vladimir Putins of the world. These are the people who have given us and who maintain the world as it is right now. And to the extent that we're looking, and it's bad. Yeah. So to the extent that we're looking backwards for what to do, we are not really going to do, I don't know, anything.
Yeah. We're looking backwards like the angel of history, being propelled forward. Right.
Yeah, there's a lot there. One, I think, to back to the question of why to study the Soviet Union from this point of view, I think one of the things that Jason and I have talked about, and I should also say the format of the podcast is usually one of us will give a presentation, which is then followed by a discussion between the two of us on that topic, or really whatever comes to our minds, having listened to each other's presentation.
Incidentally, that is one of the reasons why we have to always have the presentation, because otherwise the podcast would just be this. It would just be us talking.
Just right. Which
we already have a podcast.
It's not the worst thing that could happen, but
right. But we already have that podcast. You just come listen to this one.
Yeah. Look, but I think look at the status of the world. Look at what Chuck Schumer and Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron et al. have accomplished, which is the maintenance of this world in which you live in a city that you can't afford just to, or let's say you probably work in a city that you can't afford to live in.
Right.
For example, cities are banal gray landscapes, usually playgrounds for the rich where they can come and criticize a retail worker without facing any consequences. Although maybe now that's different with people getting canceled or something like that. Maybe it gets up on YouTube, but so what? Life is drab. I had this metaphor, I think it's a metaphor, where it's sort of like in the Soviet Union, you had people waiting in line at butcheries for meat that was out of stock. Neoliberalism has sort of extrapolated that weight into everything. Everything is you're just waiting for something that isn't there. We're trapped in this sort of long now, the twilight of neoliberalism, or I don't know exactly how to even characterize this particular social reality.
The ever-present present.
The ever-present present, right? And so one of the things that Jason and I have talked about, we're doing an episode on the Russian revolutionary tradition, is this question of the millennium, of the world to come, of a project of world perfection, a project of human perfection. And at its core, that's what the Soviet Union was. For all of its mistakes and its accomplishments and its glory and its humiliations, like at the end of the day, that's what the Soviet Union was. It was a project to make life more beautiful. Beyond that, and about this question of the left and how we view the Soviet Union and learning lessons from the past or learning what not to do, et cetera, I agree with all of this. I think we have to say it's like none of us are going to face the situation that was faced in Russia in the early 20th century or in the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. And that's a mistake that on the activist left, we made all the time. It was maybe not an active mistake, not something we were consciously doing, but to say like, well, this is just like Russia in 1916. All we have to do is what the Bolsheviks did and everything will be fine, you know?
Right.
And we had this, what we never really grappled with as activists is that history, of course, is moving away from all of this. It's actually, we're in propulsion away from this event, right? It's not going to come back. It's not going to happen again. The Soviet Union is over.
Right, for better and for worse, it's not going to come back.
That's precisely right. For better and for worse, and it's not going to come back. History is not. What am I trying to say here? Not autotelic. Autotelic, is that the word I'm looking for? That it's moving towards your goal, right? We're actually moving away from catastrophes in our past.
It's certainly not linear. It doesn't just go forward and backwards. It goes.
Well, no, it doesn't go forward and backwards, but there are things that have happened and things that will happen, right? However you want to conceive this, right? We're not going to go back to the things that have happened.
Right.
That's one thing. That's my criticism of the left and why I think the podcast is worth doing or studying the subject is worth the effort. The other one is a criticism of liberal interpretations. That it's not like, I mean, we don't have our delusions of grandeur are not quite so profound that we're going to rescue the Soviet Union from its liberal interpretation, right? But which is that the Soviet Union itself was somehow autotelic, that it existed just for the sake of, I don't know what precisely, power. It existed just for the sake of oppression. It existed just for the sake of the arms race or bring the world onto the brink of nuclear extinction. That's the sort of popular conception of the Soviet Union as just this big bête noire of the 20th century, the other bête noire of the 20th century, the other being Hitler and the Third Reich, and that somehow these things are equivalent to each other. That Hitler was just as bad as Stalin, that the Third Reich was just as bad as the Soviet Union. It's all over now. Right. Thank God democracy has triumphed. If only we could find it, right?
The Timothy Snyder and Applebaum thesis, right?
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama thesis. This is the Francis Fukuyama understanding of the end of history. It's like we have finally arrived. Now all we need to do is make what is even better.
Right.
On this episode that I listened to, you guys had a section about books that you recommend and then books that you don't recommend. and I really wanted to just be like, ooh, I know some books that you should recommend because I had to fucking read them.
Yeah.
But I mean, like whenever maybe it wouldn't be germane to the episode specifically that I listened to, but I mean, if you guys need some recommendations of shit to avoid, I can help you out there. I've got all kinds of like
especially
Applebaum, Timothy Snyder, Robert Service, Actually Service is still salvageable, but because there's so much there, but
Well, and especially
personal-
in the later seasons when the episodes we're doing about the aging Politburo, or like the Kosygins market reforms, or
Yeah.
whatever. The 70s, the 80s, there's going to be lots and lots of
Right.
there's going to be lots of stuff to read and then to tell other people that was a really bad book. But when it comes to
Right.
the 1920s, it seems as though you almost can't go wrong. Like, it's not only because Alexander Rabinovich is like one of the preeminent
Right.
authors of this particular era, but also just because even bad books about the Soviet avant-garde, about like the creation and the purpose
Right.
of theater and of art, even bad books are still going to tell you something worth knowing.
Yeah, this is true.
Never mind.
Well, what I can say on that, and I'm glad you responded well to what books not to read, because I was debating in my mind whether or not that was a question even worth asking. Why not just talk about the books to read? And it's true, on the episode that you listened to, there really isn't that many bad books. There aren't that many bad books on, let's just say, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. If you're just trying to get information, some books are better than others. Some books you should definitely read. Nothing's really going to hurt you. The other thing about these interpretations of history, that again, we can't necessarily say this podcast is not going to rescue the Soviet Union from, but I'm always reminded, and I think, and Chris, maybe you can say this is correct or not, but Robert Conquest wrote the book on the Great Terror in the 1930s, in the 60s, in the Cold War.
Right. Oh, I said Robert
Robert
Service.
Conquest.
I meant Robert Conquest.
Well, there's two Roberts. There's Service and
Yeah.
Conquest.
Yeah.
Well, right, Robert
and neither
Service-
Service is well, okay, but
Service
here's
is
the
the one
thing:
who
whether
wrote the books about Stalin.
Right.
Conquest is the one who popularized the Holodomor exaggeration.
yeah.
Right. Well, and I'm
Okay,
not going
well,
to
here we
say that
go.
the
Yeah.
famine didn't happen, but like he's the one who
Yeah.
took the Banderite / neo-Nazi narrative about the famine in Ukraine and turned it into the popular discourse about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so this is the thing about whether or not there are things that are salvageable from these texts or not, books to avoid. I would certainly recommend avoiding those books unless you just particularly wanted to subject yourself to them, or
Right.
But what I always found was interesting was that, so this Robert Conquest was writing in the mid 20th century during the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union fell, of course, finally people had access to the archives, and that's a big deal in Soviet studies, is finally you had access to the archives.
Yeah.
And so the question on everyone's mind, or one of the questions on many people's minds, I should say, was whether or not the figures in the archives would justify, I should say, validate the estimates or understandings of the Stalin terror, like how many people died in the Gulag and how many people from the Communist Party were eliminated, or the military, et cetera, right? The results were what they were. Right. So you finally have a fact and figure, and positively everybody, wherever they were on this debate, whether they were defending the Soviet Union or they were on Robert Conquest's side saying like, no, it was a massacre, it was a butcher's block or whatever. Everybody said, you see, I told you so.
Right.
So everybody referred back to these same figures and same statistics as a validation of their already preconceived or pre-established position.
Right.
Yeah. So again, I can't say that I think we're going to like set the record straight. And actually, one of the things I'm absolutely not interested in is delineating or going back over the crimes of the Soviet Union. As far as I'm concerned, any state is culpable. Any state in the modern era is a slaughterhouse. It's punitive. It's murderous. It exists. Whatever. Does that make sense? Like I
Right.
don't want to get into what if isms. I just want to say that I do believe that the state is bad. It's manifest evil. It's active evil. Let me put it that way, rather than manifest or active evil. But anyways, through all of that, the point about Robert Conquest is saying it's not to just simply say that this thing was evil. This thing is the same as the Third Reich, but in communist form or something like that. That's an history or an interpretation of events that we ought to, by now, be maturing out of. I think in the academic world, that's certainly the case. But in the world of popular history, and I don't want to say that in a negative sense, I don't necessarily think popular histories are bad. And I'm sort of attracted to this idea of like history as art.
Not only is popular history not bad, we're making a podcast about and in service of what you might call popular history.
No, totally. Yeah, totally. But that's precisely my point. I want to make some sort of contribution to popular history, to the conception of the Soviet Union, that it was not just in the service of power and evil and destruction and totalitarianism and total sciences, total arts, or whatever, right? It was a complicated event. It was a multifaceted event. There are, as Chris said, there's a lot of things that we, as not just activists or leftists, but as human beings, ought to say, like, you know, I don't think
Let's
we
not
should.
do that
I don't think
again.
they should have done that. Yeah, right. But there's also a lot that's salvageable. In the same way that you might say this about these books, sometimes it's worth getting into just to mine certain pieces of information, or just to get more into your head to build your own understanding of events. And that's something that I hope this podcast, which is going to be a really large project, like, can at least make in some small way. And now I sound like I'm being faux modest, but I mean this sincerely. Can in some small way make a contribution toward.
I thought of a book that you shouldn't read about the Russian Revolution. There's actually anything by Sean McMeekin. He's like sort of a right-wing historian who's the book that I read of his first was Stalin's War, and it's essentially how Stalin was like the Soviet Union was asking for it, and the reason that World War II happened was all Stalin's fault.
Right.
Which is sort of like, it really goes even past the sort of Anne Applebaum or Timothy Snyder or, what's her name? The totalitarian thesis dated Heidegger.
Hannah Arendt.
There we go.
Thank you.
Right.
Sorry.
Like it goes even further than the Hitler and Stalin were equally bad thesis, into the actually Stalin was worse, and he is actually responsible for everything that Hitler did. So it's and McMeekin's terrible, and it's just this like
it's like the model of Zionist logic, but with new, like the framework's the same, but the details are different.
And he also wrote books on the Russian Revolution, where it's essentially like the Bolshevik Revolution was the biggest criminal conspiracy in history. He wrote a book called Heist, which is all about how the Bolsheviks stole so much from so many people. And anyway, it's just it's really terrible polemic, like Slavophobic, Russophobic, anti-communist, like Bircher nonsense.
Yeah.
And
maybe that's how we could close this episode. We should talk about books to read and not read just on this subject. That'd be pretty.
We could. Yeah,
we could. It's a thought. Yeah, that's right. I've never read this person's books. I have seen them. Let me put it this way: I have seen them on bookshelves or whatever, and just
they're popular because everyone hates Russia right now. So he's got sort of like a lot of exposure.
Incidentally, that gets at another. That's one of the reasons to really deeply study and to really try to fully understand the experience of the Soviet Union was precisely because of how much more there is to the Soviet, the Soviet question than just Russians in just Russia. Like the fact that as a direct part of the process of the Russian Revolution, the seizure of power in Kiev is not the result of a Russian invasion. Like Russians came from outside and brought the Russianness back to Ukraine, but rather Ukrainian Bolsheviks, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, anarchists, etc., made the revolution in their own land because the same problems from the war and from the autocracy and from all the mismanagement of the limited funds, whatever, that it happened there as a result of the efforts of Ukrainians. And that's just like papered over in a lot of it's papered over in the popular histories for sure, but also in the academic histories. The treating of the Soviet Union and modern day Russia as synonymous is a terrible, not just a crime to history, but also like it's a crime to our understanding of ourselves. If you can't appreciate that that Turkmen and Tajiks and Kazakhs and also of Latvians and Finnish and Ukrainians also might have a stake and an interest in the perpetuation of a revolutionary project, then of course history just looks like, oh, here comes the Russians again. And yes, there's an aspect of that for sure. If you're Polish and you're a socialist, but you defend the government of Pilsudski. Yes, the fucking Russians are back again. Surely that's definitely an aspect. That's definitely an element. But it's not the only thing. There's so much more to this subject than just Russian history again.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think the other thing that, just to add on to what Jason's saying, is like it isn't just Russian history again. The other thing that I find frustrating in interpretations of the Soviet Union, or at least how they're communicated to the public at large, is that the Soviet Union as a social phenomenon is reduced to the personal project of one man, usually one dude.
Yeah.
It's as if it was like Lenin's little pet project. It was Stalin's pet project. It was Khrushchev's thing. As if you could somehow take all of this activity and all of these world historic events and all of these inputs and outputs and reduce it down to just one person and his maniacal will or something. And it's silly. It's just a silly way of looking at the world. And again, I have to listen to ourselves. And I know we say these things and we're criticizing the world that Macron and Chuck Schumer and Vladimir Putin, et cetera, are creating. But I think what I'll make a distinction here is we're saying this is the world that they're defending, right?
Right.
We're not saying that they made the world. Actually, I would never be so foolish as to say that the 21st century is the pet project of Chuck Schumer. And yet we are very, very comfortable saying this about Vladimir Lenin. Now, Vladimir Lenin is an incredibly important person in world events. It's undeniable. He might be and Eric Hobsbawm says that he's probably the single most decisive human being of the 20th century. But the 20th century was not the product of Vladimir Lenin.
I mean, it's a particular peeve of mine to refer to the Bolshevik Party as like anything that happened in the Bolshevik Party as being Lenin having decided this and Lenin having decided that. Lenin often lost debates. And the Bolsheviks went in an opposite direction than the way that he wanted it to go. I mean, and it's like, and that's actually not consequently, like tangentially related. That's how Sean Meakin's history books are written. It's like,
I can only imagine. Yeah.
Great man histories of people he hates. So it's like his books about the Russian Revolution are from the perspective of the Tsar, Lenin, Kerensky, and that he talks about figures, individuals, and not about like anything having to do with economic or like the broad movements of history that are like that cause people to do the things that they do.
Yeah. I want to speak up a little bit in favor of not this vulgarized version of the great man of history, understanding of the way in which historical events and processes they happen, but I do want to kind of defend a version of them. I don't just think that because there were processes, because there was a world war, because there was economic utter catastrophe, that there was a revolution, because there was a revolution that ended up being the way that, all these processes, all the things which have happened in the lead up to the beginning of our story, and also, of course, the whole history of the Soviet Union, there's much more, I think, at play than just either the will of a singular individual or a blind process. Because I don't think either one of those understandings of history really fully capture the complexity of human relations. I do think that the individual will of a well-placed, particularly influential person can be decisive at particular moments of history. Like there's a famous anecdote. It's like sometime in 1919, Lenin and Trotsky are like bedding down for the night in the Smolny Institute, I think. Whatever. They're having this conversation and
are they sleeping in the same room, like having a sleepover?
Are they on the floor?
Yeah, it's like this is
October.
Sleeping bags on the floor. And
that's October. That's the night of the coup. Yeah, that's the night of the insurrection. Take that out. Sorry.
You know what? I'm leaving it in because even if it was a coup, it was a good coup.
Yeah.
Okay,
So-
fine.
Well, and also it's a coup as a part of a
Sorry.
as a part of a
Yeah.
general uprising. Anyways,
right,
Yeah.
right.
and they're talking about, like, you know, if something happens to us, do we think that there are enough? Do we think that there's basically a deep enough bench? Like, can Kamenev and Zinoviev and whatever, can they do this? Because even though there are energies that are irrepressible, the particular form and moments of concentration of those energies really matter. And I kind of think that if not for Lenin, there might not have been an October Revolution. It might have just been the July days.
Trotsky would agree with you.
And if not for Trotsky, there might not have been a successful civil war, since he was the guy who not only led but also created the Red Army.
Yeah.
And if not for Stalin, then they probably would have beat the Poles. And
Exactly. But also, if not
Everyone
for
would have gotten puppies.
if not for Stalin, they might have lost the Second World War. But also if Bukharin was alive, then maybe they would have had a different approach to
Yeah.
industrialization and so on. The point here is that individuals matter a great deal when it comes
Right.
to how history plays out. But also, we didn't have a Bolshevik style party in the 1980s, even though we had really, really nominally educated and sophisticated nerds like ourselves writing articles and selling newspapers, because the blind historical factors also matter. It's like Trotsky said in 1906. He said, "A rising of the people cannot be made. It makes itself of its own accord," and that's true. But then once it makes itself, the way in which it's led is decisive.
I always want to push back a little bit because, and it's a good thing. I think there's a tension in the way that Jason and I approach these subjects that I want to valorize. I want to say that, but because it exists, I want to talk about it a little bit. Is there's always, so for one thing, as historians, and Jason, I don't think you're going in this direction. There's this pitfall, or the myopic sort of what ifs of history. What if Grouchy had arrived at Waterloo? That's my favorite example. How things might have been different. And they probably would have been different, but that's not the point. The point is
what if
Grouchy
they
didn't
spiked
arrive
the
at Waterloo.
guns?
Yeah. What if they spiked the guns? Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Before falling back. But that's not the point. The point is he didn't, right?
Right.
The Grouchy did not show up, and that's the thing that we study. My interpretation of this event, of the Bolshevik insurrection in October, which November 7th, right? Here's the calendar thing again, isn't so much because when Jason, you say like individuals matter more. It's what I would go even push that a little bit further. Individuals, in the plural anyway, are the only things that matter in history. History is individuals. The thing isn't so much like if Lenin hadn't been there, would this have happened? The question to my mind is Lenin would not be Lenin if he didn't do what he did. We would be talking about someone else entirely. So yes, individuals matter. We can't say if he hadn't been there, what would have happened? Would there have been an insurrection? Would there not have been? If not for Stalin, would they have taken Warsaw or lost the Second World War? Which incidentally is a huge pull in the defense of Stalin. It's like, well, but not for this guy, the Soviet or the Nazis would have won, or something like that. The question to my mind isn't so much that what if they hadn't been there, what would have happened, but they are only who they are because they did what they did. As
Right.
individuals, certainly. As part of the fabric of history, absolutely. But yeah, and then anecdotally, because we're talking about this, like Lenin and Trotsky lying on the floor in a more kind of sadder story. One of the things that always, and we'll get to Stalin, we'll talk about him a little bit, obviously, this season, because we're in the first season. Our first season, and Jason, you wanted to cover all these episodes, is that roughly the 1920s. Obviously, Stalin is going to become a more and more important as time goes on, the end of the 1920s into the 1930s. Stalin tried to quit so many times that I think it's really, really interesting. He tried to quit when there was a rupture with Lenin at the end of Lenin's life. He tried to quit after Lenin died. He tried to quit at the beginning of the First World War. He would come to these breakdowns. He was like, that's it. You people can handle this shit on your own. I'm done. The bench is deep enough, or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was always his people, the people around him, would come back and say, no, you can't quit. We like you, whatever. At the beginning of the Second World War, he thought they were going to come shoot him because of his blunders liquidating the military staff. but they always rehabilitate him or something. Which again suggests to my mind there's something more at play here than the will of one man.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Stalin is being held in place by his own cult of personality. Something else we're going to get it really want to do in season 2 is that Stalin as a public persona. There's always this Koba, like the old revolutionary that everyone knew and loved, and the guy that was kind of shuffling around in the background, and there was Stalin, and these two people were not the same. But Stalin was the only one that really existed. So when Bukharin, for example, is writing letters, and he's writing when he's in prison and he's about to be executed, spoilers, and he says he's writing to Koba, and he says, "But I love you. We have this history together. How can this be happening? You cannot consider me to be a traitor or whatever." And he's writing to Koba, not understanding that Koba no longer exists, that there is only Stalin, or the person that Koba was could only respond to these things as Stalin. Which is to say, he could only do the things that he did or was able to do and still be himself. That's a long-winded. It's not exactly. Again, it's not. Jason and I are not on opposite ends of this debate. I don't think that there is no individual. But we do have really different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, it's a matter of the degrees of emphasis.
Right.
What it is it's Jason's Hegelianism reinserting itself into his Marxism.
Yeah.
That's definitely
that's true.
I think that there is a universal, of course, and it is in fact universal. It is increasingly, it encompasses everything. And there is also there are particular individual manifestations of this universal, and the mediation between the two, the thing we might call the individual, the personality, maybe is best exemplified by people like Stalin. This particular manifestation of this universal. And like, if you get rid of, let's say they get rid of Stalin in 1940 or 1940, but Stalin's already gotten rid of Tukhachevsky and whatever, a whole generation of army leaders and also party leaders. So who's left to rally the nations, to rally the people, to defend against the hordes of the fascist onslaught? Arguably, no one. I mean, yes, there are all kinds of people who are alive. Any one person could try, but who would have the ability? Who would singularly manifest that grim defiance of the Nazi jackboot? So that's the question. And again, it's sort of a sub question, because it's not so much what might have been, but rather what has been.
Yeah.
And that is really, I agree with you. That is the point. That is the reason why we are doing a Soviet history podcast.
Right.
And eventually we will get through the first season. But for now, maybe we should just talk about what the first season is going to be.
Yeah, let's. Okay, so bringing up the list. So you have season 1, which is titled Constructing the Socialist Order from 1917 to 1927, with 2 episode zeros, episode 0A and episode 0B, the Russian Revolutionary Tradition, 1825 to 1914, and then In the Name of Direct and Merciless Struggle, Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1923. And that's the one that I listened to, episode 0B. And I got to say that it was amazing. I really liked it. And it made me excited to listen to the rest of this. Now, awesome. The thing about, as a former member of the International Socialist Tradition, about 97% of what I know about the Soviet Union happens between 1917 and 1923, because that's the true Scotsman Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, those are the good years. Yeah,
before it's even the Soviet Union, when it's still the RFSFR, right?
Right. Yeah, which we always struggle with too. Is RSFSR. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So So I mean, I thought everything that you guys went over. I mean, I think Matthew, you did a really good job of cramming what should have been an entire season into one episode, right? It could have easily been an entire season.
Could have easily been its own podcast.
I think it was God,
yeah, for sure.
30, 45 minutes, all that stuff. Yeah.
Everyone should just read China Mieville's October, and then that'll take care of it.
Well, also season 10 of the Revolutions podcast, although it doesn't cover the Civil War.
Then everybody's got to read W. Bruce Lincoln,
Yeah.
The Russian Civil War, which was an excellent book.
Red Victory. Isn't it called Red Victory? I think.
Is it?
Red
I
Victory?
think so. Yeah.
I can't remember. Yeah, but I mentioned that book in the podcast, so in that episode. So I hope I got the title right.
I think you're right. What's fascinating
Jason.
is that the first episode is about 100 years worth of material condensed
Right.
into about 30 minutes.
What do you start with? What events do you start with? Like what is the demarcation line that makes you say 1825?
So 1825 is the date of the Decembrist revolt, which
Right.
for our purposes, as just because we have to pick some cutoff points in both directions historically. So it's not the arrival of what we might call modernity to Russia, because then at that point, then we're going back centuries, and then there's a discussion about the role of universalism in birthing modernity. And that means really we should go back to the emissaries of the Tsar, to the discovery and eventual adoption of Orthodox Christianity. So 1825 is not, it is kind of just because we have to find a point of origin, but it's also because that is the point at which we can say definitively that the French Revolution and all of its ideals and all of its habits come to Russia, because it's Russian imperial officers who are split between either people who propose a constitutional monarchy, people who are in favor of a republic, but either way they want to do what the Russians don't actually end up doing until February 1917. So 1825 is the first attempt. So that's the birth of the modern Russian revolutionary movement. And then from that, you get the Polish revolts in the 1830s. Eventually you get the development of the socialist tradition in both its agrarian and its industrial form, when Marxism comes to Russia.
Right.
But what's really interesting to me about that is that is an enormous topic, and it's half of the prologue. The other half of the prologue is about a 7-year period that Matthews talks about in actually greater detail, because the closer we get to our episode 1, 1920, whatever, the closer we get to the 1920s, the more information we have to condense into the same amount of time.
Yeah.
So I honestly know the most about the period that Matthew covered. I mentioned that already, but I am most interested in the decade leading up to, this decade specifically, because of the rapid change in the sort of ideological outlook of the party. It's not like a slow drift. It's kind of like rapid, where it goes from being, the Bolshevik avant-garde, which mostly dies off in the revolution. I think that's part of the trajectory. It mostly dies off during the revolution and the Civil War, to what looks like the rule of sort of the triumph of the Russian petty bourgeois ideology by the time that Stalin comes into power. And it's not so much that like the Bolshevik party decides it's going to change what it believes. It's that the layer of bureaucracy that exists is replaced. It replaces the Bolshevik avant-garde, and the nature of the party changes. So it's like, I'm really interested to see how that happens. So let's go through the other the titles here, and then you guys can stop me and talk about anything that you want to on the way. Okay, so episode 1 proper is Soviet Authority is Organized Civil War, 1918 and 1924 constitutions. And that's actually super interesting to me, because this is state building, Bolshevik state building. And these constitutions are like incredibly egalitarian and revolutionary. So you still have the rule of the Soviet avant-garde manifesting itself in the state building project.
That's true, but it's also like that transition from this kind of utopian, high-minded idealism to this much more pragmatic, like, oh, this was happening, this is what was actually available to us. It's already on display when you compare the Constitution to, you can see how much of a drift there already is. Like,
it's the acknowledgement of the trading space for time, it's like, all right, we've got our space. and now we've got to wait until the time is appropriate for us to spread the revolution, because this is after the defeats of the revolutions that spring up in the wake of the Russian Revolution, mostly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's
All
what
right.
Hegel calls the confrontation with the moment of truth.
There we go. Episode 2, cooperativism. Cooperativism. There we go.
Yeah,
and small enterprise in the 1920s. That'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to that. That's the construction of the Soviet economy pre-Stalin is always something. It's a big blank spot.
One really interesting,
in my knowledge.
One really interesting little factoid or whatever the fuck is there's a long Russian tradition of cooperative economic arrangements and agreements between individual producers that long predates industrialism and Marxism as an industrial philosophy. So in the early 1920s, there's this competition, sort of an antagonism between the model of proletarian socialized economy and much older pre-industrial, pre-modern versions of collectivism.
Yeah, the mirror, right? The peasant collective farm.
Yeah.
The village commune, and then sort of the self-organization, self-collective organization.
Yeah. Okay. And also there's the artel, which is an earlier version of cooperative worker organization, which is, it's like the mirror for Petrograd or whatever.
Right. And that's what these sort of pre-capitalist organizations, collective organizations, were seen by Marx and Engels in one of the prefaces to whichever edition, I don't remember which one, to the Communist Manifesto, as being something that might circumvent the necessity to build capitalism before having socialism.
Yeah.
Which is super interesting to me. And that's also sort of like the drive of the Narodnaya Volya, right? Is like to organize the collective, the self-organized peasant collective farms as the basis for building Russian socialism. All right. Episode 3 is social life, law, education, and religion in the early USSR, which if you've been a longtime fan of the show, we have done episodes on the organization of Soviet law. And so this will be a fun episode.
It's also extremely complex, and there's way more than we could fit in. So again, we talk about the books to read, whatever the books not to read, and all kinds of stuff that basically I hope will show you just how much more you should learn. And also, I think whenever somebody listens to it and we get something wrong, we want to hear about it.
Yeah. Episode 4, Workers in a Workers' State, the Soviet Working Class During the NEP, which is the New Economic Project, which, more about Soviet economics in the 1920s. Good stuff. I think that at one point we came out as Bukharinists on this podcast, like within the first season. Well, that is sort of, anachronistic, but we were just talking about, like, as far as models of development are concerned, we chose Bukharin over Stalin. But anyway, episode 5, Face the Village, the Peasantry and the State. Cool. Yeah. That'll be super interesting. That's not something I know a lot about.
That is a subject, that is a topic that I think is very, I think earnestly and honestly, but like very, very skewed in terms of our people's general understanding. They think of the revolution as happening in the cities and coming to the countryside, and also the political decisions being made in Moscow and then being brought to the hinterlands. And that I think what we kind of show in that discussion, in that episode, is that that's not quite true. I mean, it's partially true,
right?
But I think one major thing to really try to get our heads around is the participation and initiative taken by the Soviet peasantry itself.
Right. Okay, so episode 6, Soviet avant-garde, theater, film, arts, and culture, which, that's that'll be good stuff. That's one of the things that we harped on constantly in the ISO days is the Soviet avant-garde and how it was abruptly just like curtailed, which I think is partially false. Like there was certainly like restrictions, but the avant-garde, the massive advancements in cinema, arts, and culture, it persists even under Stalinist sort of censorship. And I think and there's a long history of Soviet art just that goes all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and most of it is unrecognized. Unless you're like a film nerd, and then you've seen Stalker and Come and See and stuff that came out in the late Soviet Union.
Like you might know about Tarkovsky,
yeah.
But mostly, at least on the American left, mostly I feel like people talk about Eisenstein.
Yeah.
And
the guy that invented the montage, the guy that made Marvel Cinematic Universe possible. If it wasn't for the montage,
that's so true.
That is a contradictory that's the contradictory nature of reality.
Yeah.
The French Revolution is the birth of liberalism and also of communism and also of fascism, at least in the sense of it's the birth of all of the things which give rise eventually to those experiences.
Yeah, if it weren't for Sergei Eisenstein, then like the Marvel Cinematic Universe might actually have to tell stories, and that would be a tragedy. Okay, let's see.
It might need writers, I think, is the point.
Well, I mean, not anymore. Now they've got like AI.
Yeah,
AI does a good job of replacing humans, right? I think that's what we've learned.
Yeah.
Okay, episode 7. The World Revolution and Rapprochement Policies Compared. Yeah, that's going to be about the Comintern.
Yeah.
And
also about a whole list of potential, let's call it revolutionary rehearsals, events in countries like Bulgaria and Germany, and all of the reasons why there were ideas about world revolution and the justification for the existence of the Comintern, whatever you might feel about these things. Because I personally, I'm not a big fan. I'm not a proponent or whatever of a Comintern. But again, it's like, but why was such a thing conceived? And it turns out there's kind of a good reason for it.
Well, I mean, honestly, like I definitely share that opinion as well. Just looking at the massive missteps of the Comintern in like actually choking off and foiling revolution, or on accident, not on purpose, right? Just like hindsight being 2020, I could say that I agree with that statement, but also that there is a heroic period of the Comintern as well. And, that's the contradictory nature of the Soviet Union is if you have mingled like triumph and tragedy, just absolute incompetence and farce mixed with like heroic sort of brilliance. Yeah. So that'll be a good episode as well. Episode 8, Sword and Shield of the Revolution, the Cheka and the Punitive Organs of the USSR. Triumph and tragedy mingled here. You've got like the necessity of an excess mingled. So that one will be one of those cautionary tales, probably included in the absolute necessity of having stability and security within the Soviet Union.
That one has been for me a really an exciting one to do, because that's one of the places where I learned a lot. Because I can really I've really found a lot of opportunities to flesh out my cursory knowledge of not just the way that things happen, but also the way that the security state as a concept is really born in this and not because of this, but in this time in history. So that to compare and contrast the burgeoning secret police and intelligence agencies of the world, it's been very interesting to me.
All right, episode 7. Oh wait, no, sorry, episode 9. That's the one that comes after 8, not 7. Episode 9, Minority Nationalities Across the Soviet Union. Oh, this is a subject that we've dealt with several times in our Patreon episodes about books about the Soviet Union. And,
yeah, we got to make sure to make
Did
Matthew
you?
listen to
Yeah,
those.
I need help with this. Yeah, like this one is so big.
Well, the stuff that I've got has all been about like the post-war Soviet period.
Okay, yeah, I need a lot of help like in the 1920s and what the fuck is going on. Because this is like all of these episodes have been written except that one. That one's actually, unfortunately, it's a little bit farther down the list, but that one killed me.
Yeah,
as I was trying to put it together.
So this might be a good area to be searching within historical journals for articles, and I can get you access to whatever you need.
Oh, that'd be good.
Front.
That'd be helpful. Yeah, because literally I need a library for this stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when it comes to this sort of thing, the people that are writing on minority nationalities in the Soviet Union are writing about individual nationalities. There's probably some books out there that'll like lump all the Caucasian nationalities together, and then some that'll work like the Turkic nationalities, etc. You know, but yeah, I can definitely help you with resources for this.
Okay, great.
And they are both worse. Episode 10, Inter-Party Conflict and Confinement of the Revolution. Is that in Zizek voice?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. They are both worse.
They are both worse.
Yeah. Inter-Party Conflict and Confinement of Revolution, right? And that's what we're talking about, which would be like, you know, I mean, obviously, anybody who listens to this that takes the Grover Fur route is going to take serious issue with
Grover.
me referring to the triumph of the petty bourgeois sort of bureaucratic wing of the party.
Yeah, that title comes from, there's this another anecdote about Stalin, and they're having like one of his late night dinner parties, and at some point they decided the conversation around the table is which was worse, the right opposition or the left opposition, and so everyone goes forward and probably with a certain element of trepidation says which faction and they thought was worse, whether the rightist or the leftist, and they gets around to Stalin and his answer is, well, they were both worse. And I love that anecdote. It reveals a lot about the personality of Stalin. So
yeah.
It also kind of helps.
It says a lot. Yeah,
helps tee
this
off
all sounds great.
Next season.
Yeah, and the other thing, I'll say about like the next season, because the next season is partially written, and you know, if we went in that document that you're reading off of, is the episodes for that are listed as well. But what basically happens is each subsequent episode mirrors an episode from the first season. So it's basically like this topic and how this topic, the subject develops or is approached at this period in Soviet history. For example, like an episode on the Soviet avant-garde becomes an episode on the Soviet cultural revolution.
Okay, yeah, socialist realism, etc. Yeah.
Right. Boy Meets Tractor.
Boy Meets Tractor is the less impressive artistic output of the Stalin period, but I maintain that sort of Gothic communism, the like massive building projects that attempted to harness sort of like a neoclassical / neo-Gothic fusion in the Soviet Union are still badass. So looking through this, there's some good titles here, like the era of high Stalinism, Great Terror, obviously things that are really that made an enormous mark on the 20th century. Going into episode 3, War in the Modern State, Great Patriotic War, Political Life Under Siege. That's in season 3, yeah. And I got to say that if you haven't read it yet, you need to read David Stahel's Operation Barbarossa in preparation for this.
Right. You recommended that to me, and I don't think I've bought it yet. I'm going to do that right now. David Stahel, Stahel. It's great. It's also on Audible. Okay. Well, shit, that's easy. I'm going to do that right now. Okay.
I've read it.
It's called Barbarossa. Is that right?
Operation Barbarossa, yeah.
Barbarossa, okay.
It's basically the gold standard now of the history for the history of Operation Barbarossa. Okay. Yeah. And like his thesis is that by August of 1941, Germany had lost World War II by invading the Soviet Union. And because that's the high point of their ability to wage war. and that's where it peaks, and everything from that point forward, as far as like what they're able to bring to bear against the Soviets in the East, it declines.
Yeah.
And and then he basically talks about how the German war-making capacity had been completely castrated and was on the defensive by the time the first Lend-Lease shipment shows up. So that's actually controversial and revolutionary in the study of the war on the Eastern Front from the American perspective, because we like to think that the Soviets would never been able to win World War II without our help, which certainly they benefited greatly from it. But but anyway, so that's a great book, and it's like sort of the gold standard now in the history of the war on the Eastern Front. Okay. And he's got a bunch of other ones too that are like sort of like the battle for Kiev, the battle for Moscow, the retreat from the East, good stuff. Cool. Then season 4, liberalization, 1953 to 64,
that's like basically the Khrushchev season.
Right. Yeah. Khrushchev season, Lysenko. Hell yeah, dude. You got an episode on Lysenko, Sinyavsky, Khrushchev's ouster.
The space race, that's when we get to talk about like Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin,
And then season 5, consumer economy and stagnation, 65 to 82. And season 6, the end. You got topics like Afghanistan, perestroika and glasnost. Yeah. Anyway, so those are all, and it seems like unfinished conceptualizing, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but getting a background look at everything that you guys have planned, this is a massive project, guys.
Yeah,
it really is.
This is massive.
If somebody wanted to pay us,
it's massive.
If somebody wanted to just pay us to only do this, it still would take a very long time.
Cool. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it, and me and everyone else, we're going to hold you to that April 1st. You better at least have one episode out by April 1st. You
should have
bitches.
Should have 4, or at least 4 ready to go. So
yeah. Do you guys know how, like, on what timeline you're going to release them? Are they going to be like weekly or like monthly?
I think with the program we have on Buzzsprout, it'll have to be weekly. I think I set us up for like the 6 hours a month, I think. So, or something like that. So only about so much time to release,
Yeah.
So so we'll have, it'll probably go, weekly. I would say should work. If each episode runs roughly an hour, so that should be fine. Yeah.
You guys need a Patreon with bonus episodes and stuff too.
Yeah, we're going to do that. Yeah, that's the other thing. That's, if you see there in the document, I mean, God, I don't know if we're ever going to get to all this, but like there's that list of cast of characters. We've thought about doing like quick biographies on some of these figures. Yeah. Just because, again, the orientation of the podcast, or the history itself, is more toward like social events and phenomenon, but you can't really, as we're saying, tell that story without individuals. So we even have like this list of characters and how many times they get mentioned in the first season.
So incidentally, it's
numbers that you see there.
We've only talked about Dzerzhinsky like one time, or Martov like one time. And anybody who is a casual student of history knows that Julius Martov is. We could easily do an episode just about that one person, or like
there needs to be an episode on Nestor Makhno as well. I think that would be
or Nestor
if not Nestor Makhno, because he's sort of only one character in the massively complicated saga of Ukraine in the Civil War, because there's like, I guess, 5 different competing and mutually antagonistic powers operating in Ukraine at one time. 4 or 5 anarchists, Bolsheviks, whites, sort of an independent socialist sort of grouping that's against all the rest of them. So at least 4.
Yeah, depending on when you're talking, you've got the Germans, like the Central Power Germans, or the Poles, or
and the German puppet government, and then the Poles invade and then get their asses kicked by the Bolsheviks. And somehow, the only thing anyone remembers is that the Bolsheviks overextended their supply lines at Warsaw. Instead of the fact that the Bolsheviks whipped the Poles all the way across Ukraine and almost took Warsaw. I got to defend Soviet honor here,
Yeah. There's also a really large cast of really unsung figures in specifically Bolshevik / communist history. People like
Yeah.
Mikhail Frunz, Lev Kamenev, Krasin, Lunacharsky, Pashukanis, Shliapnikov, Stuchka, Preobrazhinsky. Like these are extremely important names. Like if we were to try to find an analogy, it'd be like if you did an American history podcast and you didn't talk about like John Adams or Benjamin Franklin. Like these people have played as much of a role as the Lenins and Stalins and Khrushchevs of history. But these are all the other great men of history, the great figures, people like Alexander Kollontai, people who just, they're going to get a mention in an episode, but it's, like Alexander Kollontai is, she thought this, she was doing this, and that's enough because we're talking about this larger subject. But this person is so extremely interesting and so extremely influential that she could easily have let's say a biography episode just of her own. So I think that's what the bonus Patreon episodes will be, at least partially. Will just be those.
Well, you guys should do one on the Czechoslovak Legion, the saga of the Czechoslovak Legion, because of how massively like influential on the course of history the Czechoslovak Legion ended up being. Like you mentioned in this episode, that the advance of the Czechoslovak Legion down the Trans-Siberian Railway ends up triggering the execution of the Tsar and their family at Ekaterinburg, right? Yeah. So it's like the Czechoslovak Legion was not interested in saving the Tsar, not interested in defeating the Bolsheviks. All they were trying to do was get home, but they were so like massively destructive and powerful that the Bolsheviks like panicked and killed the Tsar and his whole family. So
one thing that's
that would be a good episode.
One thing that's going to be tough for us is to try really, really hard to not spend a lot of time on the Civil War era because of how much.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Jason gets frustrated with me because I write my scripts are like 10 pages single spaced, I think, to do an episode. And it just can't. And I think I can do this in half an hour. I can read this in 15 minutes.
There's no way.
You can't because there's just so much
to
cover. Yeah.
I think it was when presenting conference papers, they give you like 30 minutes to talk, and they want you to, depends on how fast you read, but they say generally 8 pages. So if you're doing 10, you're going to be going over. But
that's why I think mine it's like 5 or 6 pages.
Yeah.
Also,
okay,
so rather than doing episodes where we spend a lot of time talking about pre-revolutionary figures, which I think we should do some, but I'm most concerned about like the differences between like Pashukanis and Stuchka in terms of legal theory. Yeah. Because that's what's going to come up in the 1920s in an episode, in a part of an episode. Mm-hmm. But then there's the pre-revolutionary years and the revolution and Civil War years of the lifetimes of people like those figures and how those factors, how that all factors into their eventual revolutionary, their role in the construction of the revolutionary state. So honestly, there are at least a couple of other pseudo seasons at work in the background this whole time.
Yeah. True. Well, I mean, and that's what Patreon's for. The Patreon episodes will be able to fill out a lot of that, I think. So
yeah.
Okay, well, guys, this has been awesome, and I'm privileged to have been able to get a sneak preview of the podcast, and I can't express how good I think this is going to be. I know from what I've listened to that it's like going to be awesome. You guys have put a lot of effort and a lot of time into this, and I think that everyone should mark their calendars for April 1st, and we will be posting links, and I think we're even going to post one of the first episodes on our feed to draw people over there, and in which case we'll post the links to be able to access it, and any other kind of like the link to the Buzzsprout page, stuff like that. We'll post all of that for you guys as well. But great. So it's pretty cool. Thanks for doing this.
No problem.
Русские и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас. Без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, и труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.